All right, here's a brief history of ConraiL, which stands for Consolidated Rail. And basically, it was formed in 1976 after a big disaster, the Penn Central. You probably heard the story about New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad merged to create Penn Central and became a financial disaster. They went bankrupt, and then the government had to step in. So ConraiL's first year of profit came in 1981. So they were formed in 76, first time they started actually generating profit. So it took them about 4 to 5 years to work out all the tweaks, to maybe start cutting out segments of their rail line, maybe reduce their unemployment and whatever else. And in 1985, ConraiL became an open stock for investors. And then in 1987, ConraiL was returned to the private sector, which then became the largest initial public offering in U.S. history, raising $1.9 billion. And then in 1997, Norfolk Southern CSX worked out some deal to split it up. All right, let's check out the ConraiL system map and how it evolved over the years. So this is a map in 1976. You can see many of the lines of the New York Central and Pennsylvania are still intact. So this is ConraiL in 1986. This is 10 years later. You can see that they really started cutting out segments of the system. So let's go back and compare. You can see this has been cut out, this has changed, this has changed. They obviously needed to cut out the, I think it was the New York Central route to St. Louis maybe, or the Pennsylvania, one of them. That definitely needed to go. You can see there's changes up by Logansport, Indiana. So this is Logansport. This whole route right here got cut out. And Lafayette. Now, I don't really know, like, according to this map, it makes it look like they owned the tracks from Crawfordsville to Lafayette. I'm not really sure. I always thought they just had trackage rights. I do know from eyewitnesses that around 1980, there was about 5 major freight trains that went from Indianapolis through Covington to Danville, and then they routed them straight up here to Chicago. Well, by 1981 or 82, they just cut it off. So we believe that they started rerouting to Crawfordsville and then up to Lafayette, and maybe they had trackage rights up to Chicago. So that's where those large trains actually went to. But at one time, believe it or not, 5 major freight trains went through Covington and then to Danville and then shot up this really crappy, this track right here. I remember seeing it back in like 88 and 89. It was in terrible condition. In fact, trains could only run like 10 miles an hour on this track. Then they finally abandoned it. So this is ConraiL in 1986. Now let's check out ConraiL in 1989. Now you can see a huge difference from 1989 compared to 1986. First of all, this big major line right here, it's gone, or they leased it to some other company. It's not even part of their system map. They literally started chopping up as many tracks as they possibly could, I guess to run it as lean and profitable as possible. Alright, let's check out ConraiL 1996, the tonnage, or million, what's it called? It's called million gross tons, or MGT. So let's check this out, 1996 tonnage map. So you can see 50, 58, you can see 42, 11, all these numbers. Let's figure out how to understand what million gross tons actually mean. So one full freight train per day, which is about 100, maybe 120 cars a day, equals 14,000 tons times 365 days a year equals 5,300,000 tons, which is 5.3 million gross tons. So if one major freight train equals about 5 million gross tons, then that means 50 would equal like 10 fully running freight trains a day. But I know for a fact that this line right here gets far more than 10 freight trains a day, or it did in 96, right? But that gives you a general idea what million gross tons represents on a map. Now, what upsets me so much, because I live around this area, when I found out how pathetic ConraiL was as far as Peoria, Bloomington, Champaign-Urbana, and Danville, I mean, this company was just pathetic. It didn't even get one. There's not even a one on this line, the old Peoria and Eastern. So I guess they just allowed Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, and Peoria to take all the business, or Illinois Central and Champaign just to take all the business, or Norfolk Southern and Bloomington and, Peoria. So this is 1996. Now remember, in 1998 they filed for abandonment from Danville all the way to Champaign. This whole segment right here, they just abandoned it. And I still don't understand, if they were getting any business from Peoria, Bloomington, or Champaign, how did they get to those businesses if they filed abandonment on this segment? Maybe they just gave it up, like, well, we don't make enough money off any of these cities, so we'll just give it up. But as you can see from this map compared to the 1976 map, I mean, it is a huge difference. Look at this. Remember back in 1986, okay, this is Frankfort, Indiana. ConraiL used to go all the way up into Logansport, and then it had a north segment and a south segment from Logansport. Well, by 1996, they just cut it off. From Frankfort, Indiana, and up north, they just abandoned all that railroad, just gave up any kind of business. In other words, they were not making enough money off the small businesses in Logansport or wherever to pay for the railroad cost. So they just gave it up. So this segment right here, this just goes up to Frankfort, Indiana. This segment goes to Crawfordsville and then up to Lafayette. Then they must have trackage rides up to Chicago. This is a map of ConraiL when it was divided by CSX and Norfolk Southern. If you notice that segment, that line that went to Peoria and Bloomington and Champaign, it's not even on their map. Just doesn't really make sense. But there's a huge difference from 1997-98. The ConraiL map compared to 1976 is just a completely different map. I mean, they really cut out every unprofitable segment that they could possibly cut out. Now, I did read on another page trying to understand how much does a freight train profit off each train car. Well, if you're a business and you run your box car, let's say 1,000 miles, it's going to cost you around $1,700 to $1,800. And from what some sources say, that is still cheaper than shipping your merchandise by truck. This says 1.3 million freight cars operate in North America. So guess what is the most popular or common freight car that you see on a railroad? It's a covered hopper. Check this out. It takes up about 30% of all train cars. And here's something else that's interesting that totally shocks me. How much do you think a brand new rail car cost? Like a brand new hopper or a tanker or a refrigerated box car. How much do you think they cost? How about almost $100,000? I would have never guessed they cost that much money. So the most popular or common freight car that you see on a railroad is called a covered hopper. In 2004, the intermodal freight cars, for the first time in history, brought in more profit than coal. So before that, coal, believe it or not, was the most profiting commodity on the railroad. So intermodal is number one, coal is number two, and chemicals, which you definitely see a lot of tanker cars. I see a lot of AMD tanker cars, which I think it holds like high fructose corn syrup and crap like that. Now these statistics show U.S. rail freight in 1920. This is amazing because in 1920 there was like 250,000 miles of rail in the United States, and now it's like half that. So in 1920 they had about 400 billion ton miles. In 2010, it had quadrupled, half the tracks and 4 times the amount of traffic. So you can see the railroads are profiting like never before. And it goes on to show that 25% of all rail traffic goes through Chicago. Isn't that amazing? The most busiest segment in the United States, which is like out in Omaha, goes right up to Chicago. But believe it or not, the railroad is bigger than all the semi-trucks and large truck transportation. And what are the largest gateways as far as rail traffic in the United States? Well, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. 1, 2, 3. Absolutely. If you ever wanted to go to a location and see hundreds of freight trains a day, these 3 areas would be where you would want to go. And of course there's Nebraska, which gets like 130 freight trains a day. But anyway, that is the brief history and railroad knowledge of ConraiL and railroad statistics in the United States.